In this video, I will demonstrate to you how you can look through a piece of writing to identify different literary or poetic devices. After identifying these devices, I will also model how you explain how the use of these devices actually helps the writer emphasize the theme or the message of the piece of writing that they've created. So the example that I've chosen is the speech called I Have a Dream by Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm going to go through, if it was a shorter poem, for example, I might read the whole poem out to you. Instead, I'm just going to read through the parts that I think illustrate my points the best. So he begins by saying, I'm happy to join with you today in what will go down as history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Right there with that first sentence, he's really demonstrating what the message or the point to this speech is that he is speaking to the people to try and rile them up so that they can try and create change in the world that they live in. Of course, Martin Luther King Jr. was alive in the 1960s when there was racial segregation within America, and he was one of the people in America that fought for equality of Black and white Americans and fought for the end to segregation and the end to Jim Crow laws. So as he begins his speech, he says, 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This statement here, actually the way he just begins it, where he says 50 years ago, is very much an allusion to Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So you might have been familiar with a speech, even if you didn't know it was Abe Lincoln, that says 77 years ago, blah, 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 blah. Well, this is structured the same way. So it's very much kind of like a holla back to Abraham Lincoln. So you have to ask yourself, why give a little shout out to Abraham Lincoln? Well, Abraham Lincoln was the president of the United States that freed the slaves. He's the one that signed the Emancipation Proclamation, the legal document that said that slavery could no longer exist in America. So as far as race relation goes in America and the move towards equality, he sort of started it all, Abraham Lincoln. So with Martin Luther King sort of starting his speech the same way, it's very much an ode to Abraham Lincoln, and it's getting us to connect all that we know about Abe Lincoln to the matter at hand that King has involved himself with. As you continue reading, I've also picked up on a metaphor here. So it says, this momentous decree came as a great beacon of light. So here is a metaphor. Martin Luther King is connecting or describing this decree, the Emancipation Proclamation, as a great beacon of light. So just like a great beacon of light would show the way or shed some metaphorical light, make things brighter, that's what he's sort of connecting back to his ideas, that his speech, he also wants this to be a moment that tells people that light, we can see the light, we can move into brighter things. It is supposed to be a symbol of hope. So as we continue into the next paragraph, we see the use of repetitions with the phrase 100 years later. So he says, but 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. Now, within that paragraph, there's a ton of devices being used, but I'm just picking up on repetition. So 100 years later, why repeat that phrase over and over and over again? Well, it's to add emphasis. And why is he finding the need to add emphasis here? It's really to contrast the hopes that Americans had with Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation and the reality of things. So he's saying that, you know what, it's been 100 years since Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and we still don't have the equality that everybody thought was going to happen when that declaration was signed. So really to contrast and to inspire people to keep fighting for the end to segregation and for the equality that they so desire. As we continue on, we have another metaphor here. This is a really interesting one, where he's saying that our nation's capital is cashing a check, and he basically is saying that He says here, "It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring the sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds." So here the comparison, the metaphor is comparing essentially the raw deal that Black Americans got. Back when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, it was just like they were given a nice big fat check that promised them lots of money. But when they went to cash that check, no money was there. The same goes for their freedoms and their equality. They thought they were going to have freedom and equality, but when they tried to cash in on that, they found that equality simply was not there. It was like the bank account was overdrawn. So in making that comparison, again, it goes back to his overall theme, is that Black Americans, heck, even white Americans, all Americans still need to fight for equality because we're still not there yet. At least in that time period, it wasn't. So I'm going to continue scrolling on just to show you one more example, or two more examples. Here we have the use of juxtaposition. So it says, "Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred." Here we are putting two different ideas side by side that seem very different. Freedom is juxtaposed or set side by side with a real negative concept of bitterness and hatred. And I think the reason why Martin Luther King chooses juxtaposition here is to illustrate that there are two different ways that you can try and find freedom and that you can try and find equality. And even though it might be easiest to take the way that shows everybody our bitterness and shows the hatred that we have for not having equality, that's not the way to do it. Is that we need to do it in a way that's positive. We need to do it with dignity, and we need to do it with discipline. This juxtaposition is kind of illustrated also through some of the major people involved in the civil rights movement in 1960s America. Martin Luther King Jr. was notorious for being a peaceful protester who really shared ideas of love. Where he's contrasted with another famous political figure, Malcolm X, who also fought for equality of Black Americans, but was not afraid to get his hands dirty when he did it, and believed that violence was one of the main ways to find that equality. So we see a lot of juxtaposition here, good and bad imagery sort of used side by side. Just a couple more here. It says, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. Quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." This is another allusion, a little nod back in history, back all the way to the Declaration of Independence signed in the 1700s, when America separated from America and became its own country. And in that Declaration of Independence, it said that everybody would be equal, and Martin Luther King is alluding to this because he's saying, wait a second, not everybody is equal, and we need to start holding our country accountable to these words that were there when we birthed ourselves. One more here. This is a famous line from the speech. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." The device that I'm seeing here is the use of alliteration. This is the repetition of the beginning sounds. So by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Now, why are we using alliteration here? Well, it's obviously to point out these 3 words: color, content, and character. And why are these words being emphasized? Well, it goes back to the theme of the whole speech, is that we are looking for equality in a world where currently equality does not exist. And previous to now, the people, Black Americans, were being having assumptions made about them based simply on the color of their skin. But now, as a rallying cry, Martin Luther King is saying, no, don't judge us by our color. Judge us by the content of our character. Judge us by our insides and not by what we look like. And that really is what this speech is all about. It's about rallying people to stand up and to change the way that things are. So hopefully this video has helped you understand the type of video that I'm hoping that you will create for this assignment, where you are taking a piece of writing. I'm asking you to find a poem or song lyrics. I want you to explain, what is this poem trying to say? What is the message? And how do the individual lines within it actually help make that message hit home? How do they make you understand that that is in fact the message that the writer is trying to get across?